Yeah, look, welcome everyone. Great to see everyone here today. And it's a real privilege and pleasure to be able to have a chat to you all today. I've been asked to talk about emerging therapies and sort of future directions in Niemann-Pick C management. And so I'm going to be going through a whole bunch of medications, essentially. But I do want to preface that by saying actually medications are a tiny, tiny part, and Ali's really emphasized that. I think that's really important to acknowledge. So what I'm going to talk about is important, but actually probably not that important in a sense. Yeah. So I'll go through it. So if I stand over here, can everyone hear me? Hang on, I'll just move that mic. Yeah, that's right.
You got it.
Yeah. Yeah. So no one in this audience needs me to explain to them what Niemann-Pick C is, but I just wanted to note there that it is divided in a sense to the different subtypes, depending really on severity of disease and age of onset. And that's important because some of the medications that we talk about, the evidence really is in the more adult or juvenile forms of the disorder. And we know they don't work particularly well, particularly in the early infantile forms of Niemann-Pick C. So just acknowledging that Niemann-Pick C is a spectrum disease from more severe to, I hesitate to use the word mild because it's not mild, but the less severe forms. And we all know that there's a real need for innovation. Our current medical therapies are really limited in what they can do, but recent approvals and new trials, I think, do offer some new hope in the space. So I'm going to talk today about what we've had for a while, which is miglustat. So we're going to go through really briefly the evidence for miglustat, where that stands, and then talk about things that have been just recently approved overseas and things that might be coming to us in the perhaps not near future, but medium-term future. So I'll start with what we have at the moment. So in terms of medications, we have miglustat. It is a small immunosugar, which means it's derived from a sugar molecule, and it works by inhibiting glycosphingolipid synthesis, so blocking some of these abnormal compounds that build up in Niemann-Pick C. It's been approved really reasonably globally and has been in use for quite a long time now, 10 or 15 years at least. In Australia, it is approved for use, so it's an approved therapy, but it's not a government-funded therapy. And this is, as I'm sure everyone recognises, quite an issue. So you can get it, it can be prescribed, but it relies on funding coming from either the hospital or the state to fund the therapy, or in fact, I know there's at least one family I know of that are self-funding miglustat to enormous personal cost. I'm not going to talk about how much these drugs cost because it makes my heart bleed. So what evidence is there in miglustat? So there's the two really pivotal trials by Mark Patterson and those groups, looking at 12 months in juvenile and adult patients, and then extending that data through to children as well. And there's subsequently been a whole bunch of sort of open label studies, studies in different countries. You can see here the data from the French groups, the Italian groups. So there's been quite a lot of experience over quite a number of years now, coming up past 20 years, I guess, with miglustat in the trial space and data space. And looking at that overall, Mark Patterson and, so I'm just going to go 2 slides back, but Mark Walterfang here in Melbourne worked with Mark Patterson to look at all of this sort of data and give us a really neat summary of what it all means. So I think overall, we in the medical space pretty comfortable to say that miglustat is disease modifying. So it does change the natural history of the disorder, particularly not specifically in the early infantile form, however. So if we look at the different types of ways we can measure whether a drug is working, we can look at blood markers and neuropathological markers, and we can see that it does seem to affect them. We can look at brain scans, and we can see that it does seem to make some differences from that perspective. We can look at the way the eyes move, and we can see that giving miglustat improves eye movements. Things like swallowing, walking, and then other things like cognitive function, psychiatric symptoms, and scales of general disability. Across all those sort of measures, if we look at the data as a whole, it looks like miglustat does make a difference. And although it's hard to tell because this is a rare disease, but it does look as though it does impact survival as well. So there does seem to be a mortality benefit, although the studies are sort of underpowered and not really designed to show that. So overall, I think we can be confident that miglustat does make a difference. But of course, there's side effects. So gastrointestinal side effects are the main things. And the reason that there are gastrointestinal side effects is because the drug blocks the way sugars get metabolized. And that happens in the gut as well. So in our gut, there's little enzymes that break down sugars. And miglustat blocks those little enzymes. It means that all those sugars pass through the gut instead of being absorbed properly. They wind up in the large intestine where the bacteria in the gut make a lot of gas. And that's can be very uncomfortable for patients, and you get symptoms like diarrhea and belly pain. Having said that, most people can tolerate them, and it does tend to settle down a bit. You can modify that with the diet that is given as well. If you reduce the amount of sugars and things in the diet, then that can help as well. So most patients are able to tolerate miglustat. There are some other side effects there as well. But overall, I guess we can say miglustat does help. There are some side effects, but they're reasonably mild. It can be hard to access. So I guess they're the three kind of take-home points about miglustat and where we stand at the moment with it. But I want to move on to some of the newer therapies that have recently been approved. And I'm going to start with N-acetyl-L-leucine. The trade name's Aqneursa. People may have heard of this more recently, and I'll sort of talk through the data a bit. But essentially, N-acetyl-L-leucine is a modified amino acid. So people may have heard of amino acids. They're the building blocks of protein. So nearly every meal you have has some protein in it. So nearly every meal you have has amino acids in it. And NALL, or I call it NAL through the talk, is a type of amino acid. It's just slightly modified. And just recently, it's been approved in America by their Food and Drug Authority for patients who are more than 15 kilos. So the background or the history to this is there were a number of mouse studies done. So there is a mouse model of Niemann-Pick C, and they found that feeding these mice the NAL delayed the onset of functional decline, slowed disease progression, and prolonged survival. There was improved motor function. So overall, it seemed to make a difference in the mice. So that was encouraging enough for human studies to be commenced. So we got the data from the initial human clinical trial in 2022. Tatiana Bramova-Ertel's pivotal study there showing that giving children or adults with NPC resulted in reductions in their symptoms and improvements in function and quality of life after 6 weeks. So you can see really short-term data, but it did seem to make a difference on all of the scales that they measured. So with that initial little trial, they went on to do a bigger trial. I think there were 60 or 80 patients in the trial, I can't remember. But this was published at the beginning of last year. And on the basis of this study, which was published in one of the more famous journals, medical journals, on the basis of that study, then the FDA's in the last 6 months or so approved the use of NALL for treatment of patients with Niemann-Pick C. So again, this was a really short study though. They only data over 12 weeks, so really short-term study. Most of the patients were already on miglustat, and however, the results did show that it made a difference, even over that short period of time, even over just 12 weeks. So I won't labor this slide too much, but on the left-hand side of the table there, you can see the different ways that they were measuring outcomes. So they're things like the scale for assessment and rating of ataxia, so balance issues, so that's SARA, so that measures balance type of things. There was the clinical global impression of improvement. There was a modified disability rating scale, the Niemann-Pick C clinical severity scale. So they used lots of different ways of trying to look at whether there was a difference between patients who were given NALL and those who were not, who were on placebo. And the numbers are all there, but the numbers aren't really important. I think this kind of graph shows it a little bit better. But the blue bars are patients who were given NALL, and you can see there's quite a stark difference between those that were given placebo, the red bars and the blue bars there, across all those different kind of rating scales. And those sort of results held true. This is way too small to see, but those sort of results held true. Didn't matter how you cut the data. So if you looked at the group as a whole, the NALL patients did better. If you just looked at patients between the ages of 4 and 9, those patients did better. So all the little subgroups there, what you can see is if the dot is to the left of that long line in the middle, then the patients did better. So it didn't matter how you cut the data, they all seemed to do better. So I guess overall, good evidence that treatment with NALL for 12 weeks led to better neurological status than those that were given the placebo. And this little statement in italics is likely going to be in the upcoming global consensus guidelines around Niemann-Pick C. So suggesting that they should be considered for treatment. And that's the sort of wording that they use. So that's the status with NALL at the moment. I did want to, before I finish on that, I did want to talk about Tanganil just briefly. So who's heard of Tanganil in the audience? I gather nearly everybody will have. So what's the difference between Tanganil and NALL? So Tanganil has been around for a while. Now it is acetyl-L-leucine as opposed to the drug I've just been talking about, which is N-acetyl-L-leucine. So they kind of sound similar because they are similar. They're essentially mirror images of each other. So D-leucine is a mirror image of L-leucine, but so it's kind of like my hands here, if the mirror's between the two, you can't superimpose them on each other, but they're the same. Does that make sense? Yeah, they're the same, but they're not the same. So Tanganil is a mixture of L-leucine and D-leucine, whereas NALL is just the L-leucine form. Now, Tanganil has actually been available cheaply for quite a long time for treatment of vertigo. And I know a number of patients in Australia are on Tanganil. It's been used for vertigo and balance problems overseas. There's been a number of different trials in different types of conditions that cause balance problems. And the results have been mixed. For some diseases, it seems to help. For others, it doesn't seem to help. It's never actually been tried in Niemann-Pick C in a formal way that I could find, at least in the literature. And before N-acetyl-L-leucine, NALL, was set on its sort of pathway towards becoming a treatment, people looked at this and they determined that it was the L form of the N-acetyl-Leucine that was the active type, not the D type. So Tanganil has both. Does that matter? I guess we don't really know because there's never been a trial. Does it work to give both, or should you only be giving the L form? Well, we know the L form works based on the trials that have been done. We don't know if the mix works. But I think that's important to put out there because there are quite a few patients who are on Tanganil. So that's kind of where that sort of sits. So I'm going to move away from acetyl-L-leucine, move to the next drug that's been recently approved just last year again in America for treatment of patients with NPC, and it's arimoclomol or Miplyffa. I don't quite know how to pronounce that actually. I'm going to stick with arimoclomol. This is a molecule that acts to enhance the way the body or the cells respond to shock. So it's what's called a heat shock protein sort of amplifier, but it also works to increase the way lysosomes function. And I know that's a little bit hand-wavy because I don't really understand how it actually works, to be honest. And I'm not sure that anyone does right down on a pivotal level. But it's been shown in the trial that was published 2 or 3 years ago now to improve or stabilize disease progression at least. And in that study, there were 34 patients who were on arimoclomol and 16 that were on placebo, and most of them were on miglustat already. So again, one of these tables, and you can see here on the left that there are a whole bunch of rating scales used, and the 5-point Niemann-6 severity scale was the one where there was the biggest difference. Interestingly, some of these other scales, there wasn't a big difference between the effect of arimoclomol and placebo, but there was a big enough difference in this 5-domain severity scale that people were happy that this was a positive trial outcome. So that study went for 36 months, that original paper, and there has been a poster published by Mark Patterson at a meeting in the beginning of last year that showed out to 48 months the drug was still effective in stabilising disease. So we do have evidence over, 4 years, that the drug does continue to work for a long period of time. And just note that contrast between what we know about the long-term effects of NALL with it just being a very short-term study. So arimoclomol seems to be disease stabilising, at least at the minimum. So they're the two drugs that have been approved for therapy in addition to miglustat. Now, I didn't sort of highlight it then, but the FDA approval for arimoclomol says you have to take it in combination with miglustat, which is different to what they said about NALL. So just keep that in mind. Cyclodextrin is the next cab off the rank. It's not quite at the same point as the other two drugs. It's still in clinical trial, but the clinical trials are well advanced and there's been mixed results, and I'll sort of talk about that. So what is a cyclodextrin? It's a kind of a complex molecule. My next slide has a big picture of it, but it's a complex cyclic oligosaccharide, and how it's supposed to work is that it binds cholesterol within the cell and helps mobilize it out of the lysosome. So it's a way of grabbing all this excess cholesterol and helping it move along the pathway. And that pathway would normally be facilitated by the NPC 1 and 2 proteins, which are not working properly in the case of patients with Niemann-Pick C. So here's our fancy large picture. So you can see it's a really complicated molecule. And it turns out that cyclodextrin is not one thing. So the way it gets made is by a complex chemical reaction called a condensation between these beta cyclodextrins and propylene oxide, and you wind up with a sort of a weird mixture of different molecules that all look kind of like that one there. So they're hydroxypropyl beta cyclodextrins as a bit of a group. So the reason this is important is because there's two companies that are working on cyclodextrin, and their compounds are not actually the same. They're similar, but just not quite the same. So because one therapy has better evidence than the other, or the same evidence or whatever, you can't quite say they're the same thing. Just important to note. So there've been a variety of clinical trials, and broadly, overall, they've been pretty well tolerated. There was hearing loss in the trials where patients got given cyclodextrin intrathecally, which means via an injection into the spinal canal and into the fluid around the brain. So the intrathecal way of giving the drug did cause some hearing loss, and it's probably dose related. But overall, there was good evidence that the cholesterol was moved appropriately or moved better than without cyclodextrin. And the early studies suggested there was potential clinical benefit, particularly in slowing disease progression, improving quality of life. So I want to take you through some of those early results. So Adra-Betadex is one of the two forms of cyclodextrin, and the initial results were pretty hopeful. Daniel Ory's group published in 2017 their experience with fortnightly intrathecal infusions, and at 18 months, the severity scores were improved on patients who got treatment. And with that same group of patients in 2019, they published some of the more clinical things like the neuropsych and adaptive skill scores, and they showed that those patients were stable over time. Now, these weren't placebo-controlled studies, so they just gave all of the patients the drug, so there was no comparator group in those studies. And then the company, I think they're called Mallinckrodt, went on to do a placebo-controlled study of cyclodextrin given intrathecally, and unfortunately the results were not different between the drug and the placebo group. So the drug didn't appear to make any benefit to having had the placebo therapy. Now, I haven't seen this published anywhere. I could be wrong, but I did look for it and couldn't find it. But I remember it was presented at various meetings. And one of the things that struck me was that perhaps the reason the Adra-Betadex didn't look as though it was better than placebo is because the group that got placebo was stable as well. So if both groups are stable, it's hard to show any sort of improvement. So that's my vague memory of what the data showed. And I could be corrected, but I think that's what it showed. So they looked at all that, and they looked at the data every way they could and couldn't find a benefit for it. And so they unfortunately suspended that clinical program. So they stopped trying to progress the use of Adrobetadex. They sold it to another group called Mandos Health in 2021, and it's sat there. I had a look at the website. They've been talking to the FDA. They sort of put updates every 3 months, but it just says we're still talking to the FDA. So I don't know where Adrobetadex sits, and there is going to be a talk on that today, I believe. Yeah. So we'll look forward to hearing more data about where that's at. So going on to the other type of cyclodextrin, Trapsol, the phase 1 study, again, not a placebo-controlled study. All the 14 patients got given cyclodextrin as an intravenous infusion. And all of the markers there, I won't go through all of that, but they all look pretty positive. Everything was heading in the correct direction. And so right now there is a phase 3 study underway. There's patients in Australia that are enrolled in this study. They're getting intravenous fortnightly cyclodextrin, the Trapsol form of it. There have been 94 patients enrolled as of May 2024, and the data at 48 weeks is being done right now. So we should have data kind of soon, I hope. So look forward to seeing what the data shows there. And I think my last slide is just going to talk about very briefly things that are up and coming. So we've got nizobaglostat. You guys have heard all about that already. So that's sort of like miglustat, but hopefully better is the idea. It's one way, I guess, we can think about it. Efavirenz is really interesting. That's an antiviral drug used in HIV treatment, but it also has some effects in altering the way cholesterol gets metabolized. So there was some hopeful data presented a couple of years ago suggesting that might be useful. So I'd be interested to see where that lands, because particularly reusing older existing therapies makes sense if you can, because newer therapies tend to be less affordable, whereas the old therapies are often more affordable. And that's a really important factor. Gene therapy, there's quite a few studies. There's some brilliant work being done here in Melbourne on that. And mRNA therapies, and Tony Cook's in the audience, ASOs as well. So there's lots of different things happening that provide, I think, real hope for the future for patients with Niemann-Pick C. So I want to finish there, but just to say there's lots going on in the medicine space, but so many other things are important in the care of people with Niemann-Pick C, not just the tablet. So thanks, everyone.